Но то, что вот этот Алеша известно Болгарии всей.
So, there's something about the dream songs that it's not that they're like uniquely great in some way, in the sense that they're like necessarily better than other poems, other works of art, but it is it is a very different kind of aesthetic. It's not something that, like, prior to reading the dream songs, I wouldn't, like, just off the top of my head be able to envision poems that kind of, like, use grammar the way they do, punctuation the way they do, like units of meaning the way they do. In some ways, like, almost kind of like, maybe the opposite of the Maximus poems by Charles Olson. I wouldn't expect that poetry to work in that way. But he did it, and I was like, wow, like, these are interesting, like, discrete units of meaning that we haven't gotten elsewhere. So anyway, like, I've sort of been still kind of like, you know, when you look at certain things in culture, whether it's like, the advent of somebody like Dan Schneider on the one hand, or the advent of poetry like Whitman, or the dream songs, or even something like, anime, from, classic anime from the 90s, there's definitely a lot of, like, room there where, you could see bits and pieces of a more kind of cosmopolitan art world that is, like, legitimately great. Like, you could see bits and pieces of what that future is going to look like, what art as a composite is going to look like. And like, he's a part of that, and in some ways also, like, it's interesting to do this as a transition into Blake, because William Blake, like I said in the last stream, even beyond, like, like, pure numbers, like, oh, how many number of great poems has he had compared to other poets before him? Is that number greater or smaller? Is he as technically adept as people before him? Um, uh, you could answer the question about Blake in terms of just conceptually, was he new? Did he represent something new? And I think the answer is yes, he did. Right. And I mean, I talked about some of the specifics on that stream. If you guys want to look at the original Blake video, if you haven't, so it's good to view somebody like Blake with hindsight, because, like, you look at this and you're like, wow, this is a poem from, what did I say, like 1789, was it 1790, something like that. This is this is a poem that was written in the late 1700s, but the sensibilities are so modern. There was somebody there that could think that way, and perhaps there were many people that thought in the way that Blake thought, but perhaps he was the first person to actually crystallize it, right? To put it down. So I think there's, like, a conceptual modernity there, in the same way that I see a conceptual modernity in something like John Berryman's Dream Songs, a conceptual modernity in the way that Dan Schneider approaches the arts, a conceptual modernity in the best of the best when it comes to Japanese anime. So Book of Thel, one of my favorite poems from Blake. It's kind of like the dividing line between his longer poems to, like, the pithier, shorter ones. But it's also fairly dense. Like, you get a lot out of it. It has a lot of the same qualities that his kind of, like, more dense poetry has. And the way that I'm going to do this is, I'm going to read the whole poem first. So those that are not aware, this is, I forget how many lines it is, but I mean, it's not that long, right? And we're just going to read it straight through, just so that it's in your head. And then systematically, we're going to go through the notes, what I have to say. I have my own commentary about some of the notes that these people have. I have, I guess it's upstairs. I have my Penguin edition of William Blake, which uses the original punctuation. This punctuation here is, well, I think, okay, so what they'll go ask the Mo would be a colon. or maybe it's the opposite. One, like one of these is a colon. You see periods where you might otherwise put a comma or a colon, right? So this is all kind of like adjusted printing in the same way that like modern John Donne, right? Editions, they usually have like modern spellings, modern punctuation. But I'm kind of torn about that with Book of Thel, the way that the original punctuation works is, it sometimes adds to the meaning, it sometimes creates new layers, which is always nice. With other poetry of his, though, like Interior, from last night when I was reading it, it was just, it's just kind of pointless. It kind of stops you for no reason. It creates pauses that are too tough. Like there is no discernible like unit of meaning there, right? There's probably something in maybe Blake's head, but it doesn't seem very communicated to me. So this is like modern spelling, so we're not going to get any hiccups here. And after the reading, we're going to just go over some of these notes and some of the analysis. So Thel's motto. By the way, this I think was added. This is the only bit of analysis I'm going to give here before we read it. I think this part was added a few years, maybe it was like 1795. It was added to this poem. It wasn't contemporaneous when this thing itself was done, right? He probably felt like he needed something like this, and I sort of agree, right? That the poem does need this piece, and we'll talk about why after. So Bell's motto: does the eagle know what is in the pit, or wilt thou go ask the mole? Can wisdom be put in a silver rod, or love in a golden bowl? The daughters of the seraphim led around their sunny flocks, all but the youngest. She in paleness sought the secret air, to fade away like morning beauty from immortal day. Down by the river of Adana, her soft voice is heard, and thus her gentle lamentation falls like morning dew. O life of this our spring, why fades the lotus of the water? Why fade these children of the spring, born but to smile and fall? Ah, Thel is like a watery bow, and like a parting cloud, like a reflection in a glass, like shadows in the water, like dreams of infants, like a smile upon an infant's face, like the dove's voice, like transient day, like music in the air. Ah, gentle may I lay me down, and gentle rest my head, and gentle sleep the sleep of death, and gentle hear the voice of him that walketh in the garden in the evening time. The lily of the valley, breathing in the humble grass, answered the lovely maid and said, I am a watery weed, and I am very small, and love to dwell in lowly vales. So weak, the gilded butterfly scarce perches on my head, yet I am visited from heaven. And he that smiles on all walks in the valley, and each morn over me spreads his hand, saying, Rejoice, thou humble grass, thou newborn lily flower, thou gentle maid of silent valleys and of modest brooks. For thou shalt be clothed in light, and fed with morning manna, till summer's heat melts thee beside the fountains and the springs, to flourish in eternal vales. Then why should Thel complain? Why should the mistress of the vales of Har utter a sigh? She ceased and smiled in tears, then sat down in her silver shrine. Thel answered, O thou little virgin of the peaceful valley, giving to those that cannot crave, the voiceless, the overtired, thy breath doth nourish the innocent lamb. He smells thy milky garments. He crops thy flowers while thou sittest smiling in his face, wiping his mild and meekened mouth from all contagious taints. Thy wine doth purify the golden honey. Thy perfume, which thou dost scatter on every little blade of grass that springs, revives the milk cow and tames the fire-breathing steed. But Thel is like a faint cloud kindled at the rising sun. I vanish from my pearly throne, and who shall find my place? Queen of the vales, the lily answered, ask the tender cloud, and it shall tell thee why it glitters in the morning sky, and why it scatters its bright beauty through the humid air. Descend, O little cloud, and hover before the eyes of Thel. The cloud descended, and the lily bowed her modest head, and went to mind her numerous charge among the verdant grass. O little cloud, the virgin said, I charge thee to tell me. I charge thee, tell to me why thou complainest not when in 1 hour thou fade away. When we shall seek thee, but not find. Ah, Thel is like to thee. I pass away, yet I complain, and no one hears my voice. The cloud then showed his golden head, and his bright form emerged, hovering and glittering on the air before the face of Thel. O virgin, knowst thou not our steeds drink of the golden springs, where Louvre doth renew his horses? Lookest thou in my youth, and fearest thou because I vanish and am seen no more, nothing remains? O maid, I tell thee, when I pass away, it is to tenfold life, to love, to peace and raptures holy. Unseen descending, weigh my light wings upon balmy flowers, and court the fair I do to take me to her shining tent. The weeping virgin trembling kneels before the risen sun, till we arise linked in a golden band and never part, but walk united, bearing food to all our tender flowers. Dost thou, O little cloud? I fear that I am not like thee, for I walk through the vales of Har, and smell the sweetest flowers, but I feed not the little flowers. I hear the warbling birds, but I feed not the warbling birds. They fly and seek their food. But Thel delights in these no more, because I fade away. And all shall say, without a use this shining woman lived. Or did she only live to be at death the food of worms? The cloud reclined upon his airy throne and answered thus. Then if thou art the food of worms, O virgin of the skies, how great thy use, how great thy blessing! Everything that lives, lives not alone, nor for itself. Fear not, and I will call the weak worm from its lowly bed, and thou shalt hear its voice. Come forth, worm of the silent valley, to thy pensive queen. The helpless worm arose and sat upon the lily's leaf, and the bright cloud sailed on to find his partner in the vale. Then Thel, astonished, viewed the worm upon its dewy bed. Art thou a worm? Image of weakness, art thou but a worm? I see thee like an infant wrapped in the lily's leaf. Ah, weep not, little voice, thou canst not speak, but thou canst weep. Is this a worm? I see thee lay helpless and naked, weeping, and none to answer, none to cherish thee with mother smiles. The Clod of Clay heard the worm's voice and raised her pitying head. She bowed over the weeping infant, and her life exhaled in milky fondness. Then on Thel she fixed her humble eyes. O beauty of the vales of Har, we live not for ourselves. Thou seest me the meanest thing, and so I am indeed. My bosom of itself is cold, and of itself is dark. But he that loves the lowly pours his oil upon my head, and kisses me, and binds his nuptial bands around my breast, and says, Thou mother of my children, I have loved thee, and I have given thee a crown that none can take away. But how this is, sweet maid, I know not, and I cannot know. I ponder, and I cannot ponder. Yet I live and love. The daughter of beauty wiped her pitying tears with her white veil, and said, Alas, I knew not this, and therefore did I weep, that God would love a worm I knew, and punish the evil foot that wilful bruised its helpless form. But that he cherished it with milk and oil I never knew, and therefore did I weep. And I complain in the mild air because I fade away, and lay me down in thy cold bed, and leave my shining lot. Queen of the vales, the matron clay answered, I heard thy sighs, and all thy moans flew over my roof, but I have called them down. Wilt thou, O queen, enter my house? 'Tis given thee to enter and to return. Fear nothing, enter with thy virgin feet. The eternal gate's terrific porter lifted the northern bar. Thel entered in and saw the secrets of the land unknown. She saw the couches of the dead, and where the fibrous roots of every heart on earth infixes deep its restless twists, a land of sorrows and of tears where never smile was seen. She wandered in the land of clouds through valleys dark, listening to Dolores' lamentations, waiting oft beside a dewy grave. She stood in silence, listening to the voices of the ground, till to her own grave plot she came, and there she sat down, and heard this voice of sorrow breathed from the hollow pit. Why cannot the ear be closed to its own destruction, or the glistening eye to the poison of a smile? Why are eyelids stored with arrows ready drawn, where 1,000 fighting men in ambush lie? Or an eye of gifts and graces, showering fruits and coin gold? Why a tongue impressed with honey from every wind? Why an ear, a whirlpool fierce to draw creations in? Why a nostril, wide inhaling terror, trembling in affright? Why a tender curb upon the youthful burning boy? Why a little curtain of flesh on the bed of our desire? The virgin started from her seat, and with a shriek fled back unhindered till she came into the vales of Har. Okay, so a few unexpected things in this poem, right? When you're first reading it, you seem to be getting something that is perhaps more akin to the I don't want to say oversimplicity because in context it's not, but some of the more kind of like simple parts of Blake's songs of innocence. You have like this like really philosophical intro, which again is sort of like should let you know that something is about to happen here that maybe is out of the ordinary. But it is a poem that does kind of lull you into a sense of complacency. When you get to the very end, this is totally unexpected, right? The fact that she wanders essentially into like some sort of like de facto cemetery, and that this is what she hears given everything that comes before, this is surprising. When we talk about something like the plot twists in a movie, right? If you're somebody that's into plot twists, this in terms of like a narrative more purely, this is like a kind of plot twist as well, right? And you have to wonder like what is the connection, what is the relationship that it has to everything else that just came before. So you have that. Let's just start with the motto though. This is one of my favorite like set of like lines from Blake. Let's just read it again and talk about it. Does the eagle know what is in the pit, or wilt thou go ask the mole? Can wisdom be put in a silver rod, or love in a golden bowl? So I hadn't read like too much analysis of this poetry before I decided to do the stream. So before I read any analysis, my assumption was always as follows. There may be a couple ways to interpret these lines, but one plausible interpretation is he's saying that the eagle, right, which is typically thought of as kind of like all-seeing, right? All-seeing at least, in the sense of like getting like a full kind of wide scope of the world, right? It's able to sort of see that, and it's able to see its way down. Does the eagle though, like, it doesn't know enough to know what is in the pit, right? Or will you have to actually not in Blake's terms and not in my terms, but in the terms of, let's say, the common person, will you have to debase yourself to go down to, the pit where the mole is, to seek advice, to ask like, is there something here that you can point out that I'm not able to see? And of course we have these two other lines, because it's only 4 lines, right? And they're close together. They're not just randomly fucking, thrown together. There's a connection between the two. So what is the connection? Look at the next 2 lines. Can wisdom be put in a silver rod, or love in a golden bowl? So here, there is a somewhat adversarial relationship between the meaning of the lines, right? He is clearly trying to set up some kind of contrast between the first two. And there's a contrast here, right? What do you think of a silver rod? The first thing that I thought of was a rod for disciplining someone, right? Like when you think of a rod, that's good for discipline. When it's silver, it is, perhaps a person of extreme authority disciplining a person. Or we could, think of it in a broader sense of, anyone with authority. It could be a king with a scepter, right? Can you force your way, by the authority of being a king? Is that good enough to be wise, right? Is that good enough to say that we could get tons of legitimate appeals to authority here, right? The clergy, right? Like the clergy that often poses with silver rods and crowns and sort of like pretends essentially that they're kind of like low key kings, right? Can we say that their silver rod means anything? And also love. Can we put love into a golden bowl in something that is just ostentations for the sake of being opulent, opulence for opulence sake? Is that an easy way, a proper way, a reasonable way to get any kind of love? Is that can we, if love is given to us on a platter and it's ripe for the pickings and everything is so easy around, can love simply be plucked from a golden bowl? And I was saying earlier that Blake is so conceptually ahead of his time. This is why I was making those comparisons to Leonard Shlain's Art and Physics. We are so conceptually ahead that he's essentially saying, if we have love that is essentially never tested, that is easy to acquire, that is easy to keep, what kind of love is that? Is the marriage of rich people in some kind of baseline always going to be less dramatic, less like believable in some regards than the functional marriage of two very poor people, because they have nothing except like themselves and their poverty, right? They acquire love, but they have to make sure not to acquire resentments along the way. Not to say that rich people don't have resentments, of course they do, but it's a different kind of resentments. You have like a smaller pool of, well, maybe you have a wider pool of resentments actually, if you're just kind of like a dastardly dandy, right? Perhaps, but anyway, I mean, these are all like reasonable interpretations, I feel. Like on the face. The question is, what does this have to do with the rest of the poem? And how will we interpret what Thel says and does in light of this commentary? So now that we go through the rest, let's understand that. So opening stanza, the daughters of the seraphim. So originally this says Mene seraphim. The commentary, I don't know if this comment will have it. No, it doesn't. So originally, like it's like supposed to be something called like Mene seraphim, which like some like scholar of the commentary says perhaps Blake meant Bene seraphim, which is like it's a Bene is Hebrew for the sons of the seraphim, which is like the daughters of the sons of the seraphim, something like that. They probably got rid of it because like that's just like a scholar's, it struck me as like a scholar's wish fulfillment yet again. Like somebody wants to believe that it's actually like his corruption of the original Hebrew. And these guys like I think it's a perfectly appropriate to say like we're just gonna like say the seraphim. It's just like a needlessly unnecessary distraction. Like it doesn't really add all that much in my estimation, although later on like I remembered some punctuation that is different here that is actually good for meaning that I'm gonna talk about later. So they chopped that off. So okay. All but the youngest, she in paleness sought the secret air to fade away like morning beauty from her mortal day. So this is an interesting set of lines because we keep veering kind of close to cliche, like this phrase, the secret air. I've seen this before in like romantic era poetry, which I guess like roughly speaking, Blake is sort of put in that category. Although I know that there's like controversy about that. So we have something that's like getting close to a cliche, but we do have some interesting lines here. Originally, before we had that we got rid of the Mene, but if we assume that it's there. Kind of like looking at the poem a little bit askance. Sheen paleness sought the secret air. Does the fact that this is a different kind of phrase that doesn't have a very obvious kind of meaning, does that somehow improve what is normally, seen or done with this? Maybe less of a cliche, more kind of like what would say like in poetry might be idiomatic. Like there's like a fine line between what is maybe perhaps idiomatic in poetry versus what is a cliche. But we're having some, we have like some limited, playing, I guess, with the surrounding context. To fade away like morning beauty from her mortal day. This is also, it sounds a little familiar, but I can't really place it. So I'm going to assume this is also like a new kind of phrase, the mortal day. But, so far, like it's not like flat out like great poetry, right? It's a little bit closer to what is sort of like more typically, romantic poetry. Down by the river dawn, her soft voice is heard, and thus her gentle lamentations fall like morning dew. Yeah, this is a pretty weak kind of end. It is like setting you up kind of for failure. It is interesting that we ultimately never do get that failure, but the question that I would ask, and I don't really have an easy answer here, is the fact that this is a setup for something unexpected. Does it justify some of the weakness of these lines? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know quite how to do that value judgment, but if you're going to get into a discussion about this, I think that would have to be part of the value judgments that you're making. O life of this our spring, why fades the lotus of the water? Why fade these children of the spring, born but to smile and fall? Ah, Thel is like a watery bow, and like a parting cloud, like a reflection in the glass, like shadows in the water. So she's sort of going on and on, revealing to you her personal psychology. So she has this like kind of classical, maybe youthful fixation on, whether or not there's more to life than, just like living and dying with no easily discern interim. It's a classic, like, I guess, existential question. Like, this is something that people ask, again, especially if they're young. So we know that she's young. We know that her question, right? Like, if you're like, I guess, an ideal reader of Blake, right? Blake writing this, clearly he is somewhere in the poem himself. He is standing somewhere in relation to the poem where he knows that this kind of like self-obsession, the self-fixation, like, oh, woe is me, is life but to just live and die. He knows there's something wrong with that. He knows that it's too self-absorbed, self-involved, right? And we definitely get evidence for that as the poem goes on. Like, it's not just me drawing on what I know historically about Blake or his other poetry. There is evidence in the poem itself to make that kind of deduction. So we see that this is her state of being right now, and some of the technical stuff, like, I mean, it is kind of interesting. Like, she doesn't even say that she, like when you think of like a simile versus a metaphor, right? The advantage of a metaphor is, and I remember like sometimes like when I would write poems, like Dan Schneider would tell me like, hey, this would work better as a metaphor as opposed to a simile, because a metaphor can get you immediately like into the picture, right? Into the comparison. There is no additional descriptive words. There are no words that you have to comb through. There's nothing for the reader to do except to immediately be put in that position, which, it's a very smart comment. And I would say that this probably is like the main distinction between a simile and a metaphor, depending on what you want to do, where you want to stand. Right, with using these kinds of comparisons, they have their different purposes. Like, it's not an arbitrary choice to choose one or the other. And these aren't metaphors, so these are similes. She's not merely as little as she says that she is. She's like, she's not just like this empty glass that merely reflects what is, where, if she were a corpse, right, she's worried about death, it would reflect a corpse. She's merely, she's not the glass, she's a reflection in the grass, right? She's not merely this water that is ever changing and can never have this, like, forever life, right? It constantly has to like shed, essentially, at least it's like, a superposition in the world. But she's like not just a cloud, but a parting cloud, right? So she's in a sense like more deeply criticizing herself by calling herself a parting cloud, right? Shadows in the water, right? She's merely a shadow in that, Heraclitean flux. Like dreams of infants, right? Like transient day, and not just day. Like, we could say that this is superfluous, but there's also a thin line between being superfluous and being emphatic. By doing the transient, you are emphasizing that part of what you'd associate with the day that is merely passing, like music in the air. air itself, fades, music in the air fades. And these are also like some of these do veer into cliche. And again, we're still going to have to make the judgment call. Is this enough like of a setup that the ultimate payoff is worth, some of these like somewhat weaker lines? Gentle may I lay me down, and gentle rest my head, and gentle sleep the sleep of death, and gentle hear the voice of him that walketh in the garden in the evening time. I found this to be, one of the better lines in the first two stanzas, right? We know that Blake is building a mythology, and even if we don't know that he's building a mythology in these poems and elsewhere, we know that there's nothing truly in this poem that would suggest to you that you have to view this like from a purely Christian lens, right? But we know that in Christian myth, and we also know again that Blake is a kind of Christian. We know that this feels somewhat Christian, and we know that this is applicable to like any kind of a generic God as well, right? Given the kind of like mass associations that people make, right? He never does get specific what he's talking about here. We know that gardens in many ways feature quite a bit. New Testament, Old Testament. Who is he, that is doing the walking garden in the evening time? And also just think about the implications here, right? He's walking the garden, right? Like what is he doing exactly? He doesn't seem to be working, right? The language is not specific enough that you would plausibly say that he has to be working, right? That could be part of the interpretation, but you don't have to, right? And the fact that it's open-ended, I choose to have a more open-ended interpretation. In the evening time, right? So perhaps it's like, when all the work is done, right? Because, even God, was given for whatever reason, who knows what the theological logic is, if it's an all-powerful, all-knowing God, why do you need a seventh day to rest? Why do you, as a God, as some sort of creative being, why do you need to observe your creations at evening time? Are you doing it, purely for your pleasure? So, this line by itself, like, there's lots of things you could do with it. There's lots of images that come into your head, and it's a nice like ambiguous thing that adds more ambiguity to the rest of the poem. Again, we don't know. We know where Blake stands in some of the issues psychologically, I think, in this poem, but we can't fully make any of these conclusions where he stands like theologically, where he stands on some of these kind of like more mythological questions. Let's see what the comment here is. Of hymns that... Is it here? Where are we? Oh, Genesis 3:8. Yeah, there's a line in Genesis that also has God like sort of walking the garden. I think it's also in the evening time. So, this could easily be, that kind of illusion, right? But again, there's a reason why Blake doesn't give you enough to explicitly say that it has to be that, right? It could be that, which is why I started with the talk of Jesus, but it doesn't have to be. And the interesting thing is, it doesn't have to be the God of the Old Testament, right? Although this is, a line that could be lifted from the Old Testament. This could just be Blake's conception of Jesus looking this way, right? So anyway. So Lily of the Valley, breathing in the humble grass, answered the lovely maiden said. So, Thel had these questions, right? She had questions about where she is in life, why she is alive, why are things the way that they are. And, her questions maybe are kind of silly to people that are older, or maybe they're silly in general to people of a certain philosophical disposition. But the lily answers it honestly and to the best of its ability. And this is what the lily says. I am a watery weed, and I am very small and love to dwell in lowly vales. So weak the gilded butterfly scarce perches on my head. So she starts with a self-criticism, just like Thel begins with a self-criticism, right? Her self-criticism is, I am insignificant, right? And she gave all the reasons why. Well, the lily tells you why the lily is insignificant, and it gives you an explicit reason why. The difference, and here's the interesting part, she gives you a reason, and it's sort of presented really matter-of-factly, but she doesn't dwell on it. She doesn't go crazy over it. This is not the fixation of her life. And the way that she explains her happiness, though, is by saying, "Yet I am visited from heaven, and he that smiles on all walks in the valley, and each morn over me spreads his hand, saying, Rejoice, thou humble grass, thou newborn lily flower, thou gentle maid of silent valleys and of modest brooks. For thou shalt be clothed in light." So, on the one hand, she has, this again, this godlike figure, probably the same godlike figure that's walketh in the garden in the evening time. She's visited by this heavenly figure. So on the one hand, she feels, happy about this, and you just wonder, well, she gentle hears the voice, thou, of him that walk in the garden in the evening time. Why is she not pleased by this? Why is the lily not hurt by the fact that she's so small and insignificant? And why is Thel hurt by this, right? So the lily says, I am small just like you are. I'm insignificant just like you are. And I have the same access, essentially, to the same God that you do. And when that God tells me, you shall be clothed in light and fed with morning manna, that is good enough. Like, if the summer heat melts me beside the fountains and the springs, I will, whether it's me personally or my descendants, like if you want to sort of take a kind of, evolutionary or even Buddhist view of things, you're still going to be flourishing in that kind of, life cycle regard. And, the lily asks, like, why should Thel complain? Why should the mistress of the Vales of Har utter a sigh? So I just want to comment on the Vales of Har. So Har, maybe the first time it was mentioned in Teriel, maybe it's before. I know it's a lot more prominent in what is it? The Four Zoas, I think, is the name of the book. Anyway, so in Teriel, which is written around the same time as this poem, Har is this. They're basically the valleys of Har and I forget her name, but Har is, I guess, is like a king or something, or an elder of some sort in this area, and the Vales are just called his, I guess, the Vales of Har, and he has a wife. And Teriel, in the Book of Teriel, is one of the children of Har. Har experiences a rebellion of his kids. All the kids sort of go off to found their own kingdoms. Teriel goes off to find his victim, his kingdom, and he ultimately sort of loses. Right, he doesn't do as well as he likes, so he returns home. Right, he returns to the Vales of Har, and he finds his parents, and he sees his father Har walking around completely senile, what we would call today like full-blown Alzheimer's, like talking, I think, to a tree. And his mother is in the same way. So assuming that, like, who knows where this truly fits in Blake's mythology in terms of like the chronology. Who knows if this is like before the conflict between Louvre and Urizen. Who knows, if this is like before Teriel returns and sees this kind of like senile kind of perfection. But, if you take, like, we're not supposed to bring the outside context, but like, if you see this as like connected in some way to other poems, and this is like a book of poems connected to other books of poems, I mean, just contextually, you're going to ask yourself, like, doesn't it add something, interesting and substantive, and like at least to the mood that we know that Thel, who's kind of immature perhaps in some ways, clearly young in some ways, we know that she lives this kind of like, idealized existence, right? In the Vales of Har, in this place where like the authority figure is just senile, and everything is this kind of like perhaps perpetual forgetting. I think that context adds a lot to the poem personally. You don't have to bring that in. Like, you could just like before I even like read about this stuff, like, I always thought of Vales of Har in this kind of more generic sense of like, we could say Vales of Har, we could say that she's like going up and down this area, and we know in our heads that it's already idealized in that regard, right? We don't have to add this other stuff in, but bringing some of the context, like the way that she behaves near the end, the way that she keeps asking this question, you keep wondering, well, why is she not satisfied with the answer that she's getting? that kind of perpetual forgetfulness, like with this kind of more, wider mythos kind of interpretation. I think it does add to it, and there's nothing wrong if you want to make that kind of addition. Okay, guys, so don't be scared. I know Dan Schneider is not so hot on it. Personally, I'm not so hot on it either, but I like to add this kind of stuff in, and I think with a long enough span of time, these things that maybe some of us find kind of silly, society might very well select for as part of its value system in the arts. Like they will say like, wow, like yeah, and Blake really did have this detail, and he really did make Thel this like immature figure just by having this light reference to his own myth, right? That you could just miss if you don't know about it. I see that as part of the future. So Thel is giving this answer like, look, I am consumed. I'm gonna live on. God loves me, or this symbolic figure loves me. Why are you complaining, Thel? And Thel answered, essentially kind of like to deny everything that was said by the lily of the valley. She says, "O thou little virgin of the peaceful valley, giving to those that cannot crave, the voiceless, the overtired. Thy breath doth nourish the innocent lamb. He smells thy milky garments. He crops thy flowers while thou sittest smiling in his face, wiping his mild and meek mouth from all contagious taints." I've never found what this means. I couldn't find any kind of like commentary anywhere. I just don't know what this is. So if somebody knows, that'll be great. Thy wine doth purify the golden honey, thy perfume, which thou dost scatter on every little blade of grass that springs, revives the milk cow, and tames the fire-breathing steed. But thou is like a faint cloud kindled at the rising sun. I always find that line wonderful. Thou is like a faint cloud kindled at the rising sun, right? Think about the chances that the cloud has, right, of surviving the sun when it's merely kindled at it, right? Perhaps it's going to be dried up by the power of the sun, right? Perhaps you could interpret this kindling as just kind of like this little light that's like raging against the power of the sun. Maybe there's something else, right? But there's a lot of interesting ambiguous layers here. This is a different kind of line. I vanish from my pearly throne, and who shall find my place? Well, even by the logic of her own answer, it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, right? Thou virgin of the peaceful valley, giving to those that cannot crave. That I also find that wonderful. Like, what does that mean? Giving to those that cannot crave. Like, what kind of understatement is that? You are so weak and meek and mild that you cannot even bring yourself to make demands, right? You are a hungry lamb, but you're going to control your bleeding. You're going to control your feelings because you're supposed to hold it together, right, guys? So you cannot even crave. But I mean, doesn't Thel probably do the same thing? Like, the daughters of the seraphim led round their sunny flocks, all but the youngest. We know that she's had some kind of access, right, to these flocks, right? We know that perhaps she's doing some kind of shepherding. Perhaps she's doing some kind of watering. Perhaps she is in some kind of, emotional connection with like animals that she sees or something, right? We know that she is in some kind of relationship with the world around her, right? And if we assume flocks means anything, we will assume that she is also, giving food to animals, giving food and water to plants, right? But to her, that's not good enough, right? So she's complete, she accepts the answer of the lily of the valley when it refers back to the lily of the valley, right? But she does not accept the lily's answer when there's clear analogs that apply to her, right? This is what I was saying with that J-Cho shit, right? All these quotes, right, that apply to everybody except yourself, right? This is the thing about tribalism. Every answer that other people have seems bad, and every answer that they have clearly has no application to you. This is the fucking IDW Achilles heel. Well, they probably have like 5 Achilles heels, but this is to me the most visible one and the most obvious one and the most self-serving one, right? So anyway, not to get too fucking off track here. She's not accepting the answers that she's being given, right? So, she's just like she's looking for new doctors for second and third opinions, right? She gives all the reasons why the answers work for the lily, and all the reasons why this does not apply to herself, right? So she's going to vanish, and who shall find my place, right? This is her justification for feeling the way she does. And anybody, that loves, and has grown any affinities to their like personal, let's say, depression, you'll see how hard it could be. I'm not someone that's ever really truly been depressed, but I've been dealt, especially when I was younger, I've been really angry in my life, right? It's hard to give up the anger, right? The anger is comfortable. It situates you in the world in a place that you understand. It colors things in a way that is comfortable. If you are, a chronically angry youth, as I was, it gives you also, ways to like negotiate power, right? Like people don't want to. People don't want to talk to you or argue with you, and people want to give in to you, like if you're loud and obnoxious and annoying and angry, right? And she has though, like she has the same like things that she doesn't want to give up, right? She has this like feeling of like woe is me that she wants to keep alive, right? There is satisfaction there. It's what's his name? Cosmo Vitelli, the Ben Gazzara character says in Killing the Chinese Bookie, like I'm only happy when I'm angry. I'm only happy when I'm sad. Like, that wasn't just like a throwaway, like, what does he mean by that? It actually means something, right? And if you think about it, and if you think about other people and you think about yourself and you're honest with yourself, how, pretty much any criticism in the world in some fashion has at some point applied to you, right? And applies to Thel. Queen of the Veils, the lily answered. So like this is like the lily getting impatient. Like, okay, so if you want a second opinion, ask the cloud. The cloud descends, and she's like bitching to the cloud. I charge thee to tell me why thou complainest not when in 1 hour thou fade away. So you're going to disappear in an hour. The lily might disappear, over a longer time span, and I will disappear as well. What makes you happy, thee? Right? Then we shall seek thee, but not find. Thel is like to thee, I pass away, yet I complain, and no one hears my voice. Right? So, but this is like a uniquely human thing, right? You can't imagine, right? Like that. It's like that Walt Whitman line in Song of Myself when he says something like, "I would like to go and be with animals. They are so placid and self-contained," or self-content, or something like that, but the word is placid plus like something else. And Waltman says that they don't stay up all night weeping for their sins, and they don't go on their knees, worshiping their ancestors and demanding that others worship in the same, right? They're not angry. They don't have much to prove. Like, this is not a purely animal complaint. This is a human complaint. Right? It's like that. It's like William Blake's The Fly. Instead of bringing us down to animals and asking, "Am I not a fly like thee?" you should ask, "Or art not thou a man like me?" Okay? Let's imagine if everything else was a person. Let's imagine a fucking cow complaining and no one hears his voice. Like, you'd think there's something sick about that. A flower, right? There's something sick about that. But we think simply because we're human beings and capable of thought, we think that this is legitimate grievance. Yet I complain and no one hears my voice. And that's not to say that obviously we should have a society where legitimate complaints, and even like perhaps not even so legitimate complaints, should be heard, and people should be sort of catered to at least enough that certain baseline concerns and complaints are no longer reasonable and no longer could be made. But human beings, and I know this because I am one of these people, we do overindulge the worst of these feelings, right? I complain and no one hears my voice. Imagine an animal doing that, right? This is why Whitman says he wants to go and live with animals. So again, Thel reiterates her complaint, and this is what the cloud says. Again, it's essentially the same as what the lily says. Like, it's a second opinion that is, in different words, exactly saying what was said before. O virgin, knowst thou not our steeds drink of the golden springs, where Louvre doth renew his horses? Look'st thou on my youth, and fearest thou because I vanish and am seen no more? Nothing remains. When I pass away, it is to tenfold life. Again, this is applicable to Thel. To love, to peace, and rapture is holy. This is, especially if you're Thel that does believe in, it seems like some kind of God, some kind of afterlife. There is some spiritual component. Aren't you going to pass away like through your physical, of your corpse feeding others? Won't you vanish to that as well? And like, isn't that like a positive kind of life? But according to Thel, no. So upon to love, to peace, and raptures holy, unseen descending, weigh my light wings upon balmy flowers, and the court of the fair I do, and take me to her shining tent. The weeping virgin trembling kneels before the risen sun, till we arise linked in a golden band, and never part, but walk united, bearing food to all our tender flowers. So, the cloud just says all the good things that it does while it's alive, right? And then I guess while it's condenses into water and just dissipates. And Thel says, like, yeah, I see what you're saying, but she says, I fear that I am not like thee, right? For when I walk through the vales of Har and smell the sweetest flowers, well, maybe sometimes you do, maybe sometimes you don't. I hear the warbling birds, but I feed not the warbling birds. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. The fact that you have a fucking garden, right? You're feeding the birds. The fact that you have animals around you, there is an indirect relationship with these birds. They fly and seek their food, oftentimes from your fucking garden that you're trying to like probably, hide from them, right? And it's always like a war of attrition. You never successfully do it, do you? You're just trying to keep the population down. But Thel delights in these no more because I fade away. So again, the clouds, she on the one hand admits to the cloud that you're right. But then she says, even if I do delight in such things, even if I would, I can't because I fade away. But she already conceded that the cloud is perfectly legitimate to be happy, even though the cloud fades away. The lily of the valley is feeling legitimately like she, is happy, even though it fades away because look at everything that it does for the world, right, and for everything around it. But the virgin, right? Like it's this like back to am I not? Art not thou a man like me? She says like this isn't good enough for me. I am a human being and you're not. I am a person and I have these fixations, right? Because I vanish, right? Because I vanish, right? Because I fade away, I cannot delight, right? I am a special case. I cannot die. You can die, I get it, fine, but that cannot possibly happen to me. She has not learned, right? That poem from the Songs of Experience. That's why I'm saying that we know that Blake, where he stands in relation to this poem. You could always overstate these things, but we know that on this psychological question, right? We know that this is where he stands in this question. So without a use, this shining woman. So this is like a wonderful line, right? And all shall say after she dies, without a use, this shining woman lived. Or did she only live to be at the death the food of worms, right? I find that very lovely, right? This shining woman, right? Without a use, right? She was just there to be looked at. She was just there to be worshipped. She was just there to shine, right? She was just there to be a kind of like metallic object, a prize of some sort. But she had no deeper utility. So the cloud says, okay, let's talk to the worm. Okay, you want your fucking third opinion? Let's talk to the worm. So she talked to the worm. The worm, seems too young to want anything to do with this. So the Clod of Clay, which is ostensibly the mother of the worm, says again like exactly what sort of we've been saying, what Blake has been saying in this poem and other poems. O beauty of the vales of Har, we live not for ourselves. Thou seest me the meanest thing, and so I am indeed. My bosom of itself is cold, and of itself is dark. But he that loves the lowly pours his oil upon my head, and kisses me, and binds his nuptial bands around my breast, and says, Thou mother of my children, I have loved thee, and I have given thee a crown that none can take away. But how this is, sweet maid, I know not, and I cannot know. I ponder, and I cannot ponder, yet I live and love. Again, the same set of answers that we always had. This is just like words said in a different way. And this is one of those things where I think a lot of this like individual stanza is good. And I think a lot of what came before, even though I've been kind of critical of some of the lines, a lot of it is good in those respects. But you are thinking like, okay, like, well, we keep seeing the same thing said in different words. Like, what does this mean? And by the time you get to the end of the poem, you see exactly the function of why she was on the one hand told, three identical things in three different ways by three different agents of the same life and death and everything that she's fixated upon. That explains her sudden fear and her running. That explains why we have this the only thing maybe that could scare her into her wits, not out of her wits, maybe into her wits, like how can she fucking grow up? Well, let's deal with that reality. Let's deal with the eye or the ear not being closed to its own destruction. Let's scare you, Thel, into your wits by first scaring you out of your wits. And then as you collect them, you'll understand why going around and just going about in this way, like asking these kinds of questions, it's very unbecoming of a maiden. It's very unbecoming, of an adult male, hopefully. So we get this answer yet again, and the daughter of beauty, right? The daughter of beauty has the same idea, the rote intellectual dark web IDW response. She's doing the Jordan Peterson thing. I get it. I get why this applies to you, and I get why this applies to everybody else that I just spoken to, but it doesn't apply to me. Alas, I knew not this, and therefore did I weep, that God would love a worm I knew, and punish the evil foot that willful bruised his helpless form, but that he cherished it with milk and oil I never knew, and therefore did I weep, and I complain in the mild air, because I fade away, and lay me down in thy cold bed, and leave my shining lot. And this is kind of interesting because, we know like what happened to the snake in Genesis is kind of functionally like, if you're going to take like a biblical explanation of, if you're going to take a biblical understanding of this poem, right, to some degree, and of life, and of maybe Blake's mythology, we know what happened, right, in the Bible. We know that in Genesis, the snake has to now, on your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat, right? And you shall be trampled underfoot, right? So those are the three elements. You shall live on your belly, you shall eat dust, and you shall be trampled underfoot. What did she say? Bruise, or is bruise from Genesis? Anyway, ostensibly the same thing should have or must have happened to the worm, because the only time you see worms, usually are worms that are just kind of like desperate, coming out in the dirt, right? If you're walking down the street, they're dying, they're trying to find dirt, and sometimes they get stepped on, they get bruised underfoot. Okay, so the fate of the snake in this kind of like quasi-biblical story is the same fate of the worm. So you're sort of asking yourself, so we know that she's in the Vales of Har. We know if we sort of take the Blake mythos, this is a land where like the adults in the room, as it were, a very unfortunate phrase that has become famous over the last few years, I must say. The adults in the room are senile, right? That's what the adults in the room are doing. So we know that this is not like a realistic depiction of the world as it is. So you have to ask yourself, is Blake saying something that we don't know? Like, does Blake actually feel that the worm's lot is to be like anointed with fucking oil by God? Or is the lot of the worm exactly what he knows for a fact to be like the lot of the fly, which is, my thoughtless hand has brushed away, right? Till some thoughtless arm shall, or hand, I forget what it was, shall brush my wing. Like, are we subject to the same thing that happens with the bruising of the snake underfoot and eating of the dust on its belly, the bruising underfoot of the worm, right? It is Thel in this kind of like, perpetual stasis, like in a world that's not truly the world as we know it. Um, we are. So she's told, talk to the clod of clay. I heard thy sighs and all thy moans flew over my head, but I have called them down. Right. Interesting line, right? I heard thy sighs and all thy moans flew over my roof, but I have called them down. Okay, where did you call them down exactly? Just to give this answer, or did you call them down like into this like nether world that you're inviting to Thel to go down to? Are you telling her that the sum of these moans and these sides and these complaints are about what you're about to experience? Is the only way to get an answer for these questions that you have about to be what I've just done. What relationship does the clod have to everything else, right? So this is why you have to legitimately ask yourself, especially like if you're reading poems that are, part of like when Blake is working on these myths, when he says, "Art not thou a man like me?" When he says that, you have to kind of assume that some of these animals, even like a clod of clay, that they have, a wisdom that's not being spoken, that they have a wisdom that might not even be apparent, through the poem itself. Maybe that wisdom gets imparted over a network of poems. Maybe this wisdom does exist in the poem, but is enriched by a network of poems. Or maybe, as in this case, this wisdom really comes not just here, not in the three answers that she got, but it comes also at the very end. So she gets invited down. The eternal gate's terrific porter lifted the northern bar. Thel entered in and saw the secrets of the land unknown, right? And this is kind of beautiful because you don't really get told the secrets, right? You get told maybe some secrets, right? You see the couches of the dead. That's beautiful, right? They're just sort of what they're lying there, like it almost kind of like a Roman decline that ends in actual death, right? You imagine like Romans on their Turkish imported divans. So the couches of the dead, right? Not even necessarily like the dead are there, perhaps like it's just it's just their resting spots for now. And where the fibrous roots of every heart on earth infixes deep its restless twists, a land of sorrows and if 'twere never smile was seen, right? So she saw the secrets, and we know there's many more secrets right here, right? And this is one of the ways that that he's a mature writer. Blake is a mature writer. We are not getting all this like hyper-fucking specific detail. Like maybe if the new house is still watching this, he could comment later. He knows more about like the specific of art and especially art history than I do. Although we take different like artistic perspectives anyway. Maybe he could have a comment on this. Like, I hate hyperrealism because hyperrealism, as like a painting movement, strikes me as this like pointless thing where, all you're doing is just making people marvel at your technical prowess and making things look hyper realistic, making things look like a photo, right? And I have never seen much utility there. Like if the difference here is that it just simply took like technically more technical skill to make this thing look indistinguishable from a photo, there's only a certain there's a certain ceiling there for artistic communication. Like if this is like if this is where you're introducing into art, right? This is the leverage that you're getting. You're getting like you're getting like the hyper realism. You need to do something with it, right? It's not good enough to just have it. There has to be a point to it. Why do we have, for example, movies versus cartoons versus anime? Would a South Park movie work as well, generally speaking, Like if we do that simulation with like artists working on each, if we do that simulation like a few thousand times, like why does the South Park movie from like I think it's 1999, why does what it does, like why is that so good? And why and what would it give up if it were to do it as a movie, right? I say the same thing here. Like Blake implicitly sort of understands this, and he says, "Listen, I'm not gonna give you every fucking secret of this hell. I'm barely gonna describe this underworld. I'm simply gonna say that Thel entered in and she saw the secrets of the land unknown, and she's not going to speak. She will never ever speak from this point on except to shriek. Okay, so we know that she must have seen something, and we get a couple of hints of what she sees, nothing more. We get these highly memorable lines, right? This is how Thel's like escape into like the world of the dead. This is why it's so memorable. You're not given a fucking like, George Eliot Middlemarch ass esque paragraph that goes on 2 pages that by the time it finishes you forget what the description was about. You just get one line at the beginning. The eternal gate's terrific porter lifted the northern bar. What a fucking slow, languorous ass line that is. Just try to pronounce it. See how long it takes. The eternal gates, and you have this like you have this like possessive plural here, which everything is just like in this line is meant to fucking stop you in your tracks. The eternal gates, terrific porter lifted the northern bar, right? You start heavy, you end heavy, you end on a colon. I think even on the in the original punctuation, you end in a colon. So that's a pause. You're pausing. You see this image. Like what is like who is the terrific porter? And why is he or she or it terrific? Like you don't know that. Why are these gates eternal? What must they look like? You don't get that description. You just know that they're eternal. Okay, imagine what that looks like. You know that the porter's terrific. Imagine what that looks like. The northern bar. Okay, is there a second gate? Imagine what that looks like. Imagine where we're standing. Situate yourself. Thel entered in and saw the secrets of the land unknown. So what you're getting, the couches of the dead and the fibrous roots of every heart on earth, and fixes deep its restless twists. You're not gonna fucking forget that. You're much more prone to forget one paragraph of Middlemarch because there's too much shit. The brain does not function in this way. The brain is not gonna remember this shit. The brain is gonna, it's like you give that much stimulation, it's off to the races, and everything is just a big fucking abyss. A land of sorrows and of tears will never smile. We've seen that's all you get, right? You don't get other secrets, and you get the speech as well, right? She wandered in the land of clouds through valleys dark, listening dolors and lamentations. Waiting off beside a dewy grave, she stood in silence, listening to the voices of the ground, till to her own grave plot she came, and there she sat down, and heard his voice of sorrow breathed from the hollow pit. Maybe again, Art House could have a comment here in the comments. I don't know what like where this works exactly in Blake's mythology, right? I don't know like where to fit in like her own grave, and now she's like watching it. This is something that Blake would potentially even do like in a Song of Experience, even without going to that mythos. But maybe there is something there in Blake mythology where the meaning of this is more obvious, besides like some of the meanings that we come up to, which is like one of the meanings is like if you continue on in this way, if you continue on in this way, you're gonna like this is your conclusion, or perhaps like Thel, come face to face with yourself, let's fucking do it, let's make you shriek out of here, let's scare you out of your wits so you could coalesce back into your wits and not ask these silly ass questions anymore. Anyway, she sits down, and this is the voice, right? And of course, right, the most, well, maybe the Thalismato is more famous, but this must be a close second. Why cannot the ear be closed to its own destruction? What can that mean? Well, I'll tell you what it could mean. This thing, Thel, that you're doing, you're fucking walking around, going on in your completely inappropriate manner, asking these questions. You are kind of setting the roots of your own destruction. Imagine being fixated on your own mortality in the way that Thel is, like into like late adulthood, right? Into old age, right? Into your own death, right? I used to like do this thing that I loved, which is dream yoga. And in dream yoga, you basically try to wake up every couple of hours, specifically for the purposes of consecutively entering into lucid dreams. And there's like, it's not just like generic lucid dreaming. There's like, it's more like, I guess, like a practice, right? One of the things, like one of the books that I've read on dream yoga is, he makes a comment there. I forget the name of the author, but he makes a comment that makes a lot of sense to me. He asks, if you can't control yourself in your dreams when you're sort of out of your wits, if you can't be someone that like controls your like landscape in a dream, like if you can't do vivid dreaming, if you are someone that has nightmares and can't confront these nightmares into dream and say, listen, this thing that I keep having, that keeps saying, I can now confront, and I could do it in a way that will allow me to bring this to a conclusion in a dream. He says, if you can't do that in a dream when you're constantly suffering from either nightmares or, whatever, or, just dreams that you don't like, visions, things are just disturbing, right? Like that wonderful intro to Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha, right? Where Siddhartha had these uneasy dreams, right? If you can't control these uneasy dreams in life, what is going to happen in death? Because, you don't want to fix it on your death too much. But personally, when I'm dying, I want to leave the world in a way that is noble. I want to do it in a way that's not like bitchy and complaining. I want to do it in a way where like, oh my God, I can't believe it's finally happening. I want to have dignity, right? And if you go on in your whole fucking life with these kinds of questions, right, they're undignified. Are you not like constantly seeking out your own destruction? Right? And your ear, right? Your ear craves these questions, and it craves these answers, right? And you can't find a way to close that ear, right, to these questions, to these answers, right? Or the glistening eye to the poison of a smile, right? All the lily of the valley, everybody that she encountered was very happy-go-lucky, right? Is that a poison of the smile? Because, we know where ultimately she was led to. Maybe. This could be a reference to something else entirely. This could be just a reference to the reality of everything outside of these, like, amnesiac veils of horror, right? Why are eyelids stored with arrows ready drawn? I mean, that's beautiful, right? Like imagine, like blinking or keeping your eyes closed. The effects of like talking to someone when constantly like you're on the offensive, right? You're trying to like get somebody, right? These are arrows ready drawn. Where 1,000 fighting men in ambush lie. Like Thel never fucking has seen something like this in her amnesiac ass world. Or an eye of gifts and graces showering fruits and coined gold. I read, I forget where this shit was, but I was reading some kind of critical commentary that said Thel's motto was added as an afterthought. They said clearly an afterthought. They used the word clearly. What is clearly an afterthought about this? Someone that actually writes, like, let me give you some insight into this. Blake wrote this poem and he told himself, hey, I need something else here, like to sort of gel everything together. Thel's motto, the existence of this thing objectively, makes this poem better, right? You could argue like whether it's like a huge difference, but it makes it better. This thing is good. It's a great set of lines, flat out, period. It has very nice connections to the rest of the poem. It makes it better, okay? So we don't have to say things like clearly an afterthought. Like we could understand this as a work of art, right? It makes it better. But what is the connection here, right? Look at this voice. What does it say? Or an eye of gifts and graces showering fruits and coined gold. Is that ever good enough, right? Is that golden bowl good enough? Is that enough of an appeal and authority for it to be right more often than not? To go back to the fucking J-Cho thing, if that is your gambling edge, are you going to take the probability that simply something that is presented to you so easily that you could pluck, that's presented to you in a platter, is that going to be worthy of your time? Are easy things worthy of your time? Is that silver rod being held by a clergyman or a king, is that enough? Right? So this is not an afterthought. It's clearly not an afterthought. Let's use the language against the critics themselves. Why a tongue impressed with honey from every wind? I love that too, right? I think so. A tongue impressed, right? So this is a tongue that you could say impressed in a couple of ways, right? It's actually like impressed in the metaphorical sense of like, wow, like I'm really impressed by some bullshit that somebody's saying, right? Some random honey from any wind, right? Like this pollen or whatever you want to call it, however you want to you negotiate this image poetically, it's just coming like willy-nilly, haphazardly at you, right? It's honey coming from every wind. Why are you so impressed by it? And specifically, why is your tongue impressed by it? And think about what impressed means literally, right? Like an impression is like, imagine walking in the sand, right? Your feet make an impression into the sand. So why is the tongue so impressed by this that perhaps it starts repeating this shit, right? Maybe you hear some kind of bullshit Jordan Peterson wisdom, right? And you think, this is what I need to think about. Or you hear this kind of like, woe is me sort of Thel commentary, which is very common among young people. Young people say it all the time, and they hear other people, young people say it. So they're impressed by it because it's sort of all around them. Or like how Newhouse said, hey, Alex, like, let's fucking get to William Blake. Let's stop talking about this boring political ass shit. Why are we so concerned with like, why shouldn't we just like sit here and be like, fuck everything, let's only talk about the arts, right? Why do we feel the need, and I've asked this question before in my life, why do I write essays on total fucking morons like I said I wasn't going to say stuff like this, but I've written essays about various morons and you could find them. But why? Why should I be concerned about morons? Shouldn't I be concerned with Blake? Very psychologically, like, this is not what I would associate with a typical like 1700s person, but the question is like, is it simply that Blake was the first one to do it? Again, going back to the Leonard Shlain Art and Physics, Leonard Shlain says, this is how I explain visual art by appeal to scientific understanding that artists make before they're actually known. If we go to poetry, the understandings are not going to be scientific. They're going to be things like insights into psychology, okay? So, at that time, we're like, those insights into psychology, they probably existed, but they were not put to paper, right? They were not formalized. And here we have a formalization in this poem. Why an ear, a whirlpool, fears to draw creations in. And yeah, I mean, like, again, like input, output, or like whatever. I mean, there could be other ways to interpret this, but like, whatever that you're taking in, that's where you're taking out. You have only limited space and time. Like, if you want to spend time in politics, like, that is going to be less time on things that are perhaps more substantive pursuits for you. Why a nostril wide, inhaling terror, trembling and affright? Why a tender curb upon the youthful burning boy? Why a little curtain of flesh on the bed of our desire? Yeah, I mean, I'm sure I could leave this to your imagination, right? All manner of ways you could interpret this. And this is how it ends, right? The virgin started from her seat and with a shriek fled back and hindered till she came back into the hails of innocence, amnesia, whatever, right? Don't let them, right? That ominous they always wants to get you to fucking, pigeonhole yourself into an answer. You know why? So then they could nitpick that answer, say, well, maybe you mean something else. And, there's always a nitpick for every answer. So always give broad answers is my response to those kind of debate tactics. So there was some commentary that I wanted. So like back to this, Louvre, they do they mention this? Here, the spirit of the sun, the Greek Apollo, later identified with Orc. So, in Blake mythology, we get a Louvre, and we have your reason. Your reason, kind of like it's Urizen. So it's kind of like almost like your reason, right? Like that is supposed to be Blake's kind of like godlike figure that is trying to control the world through reason. Louvre, and I think this is from the four Zoas. Louvre is he at first, like, I guess, pretends to enter into an alliance with your reason, and Louvre is supposed to help your reason control the world by your reason is doing, is controlling it through reason. Louvre is controlling the world through emotion, right? So that Louvre, Luv, it's supposed to, I guess, sound like love. But at some point, he actually, like, turns his back on your reason. He does not want to control the world in that way, and so he steals your reason's horses, right? And this is before, the mythology truly kind of, like, finds a conclusion, because there is, like, a beginning, a middle, and an end. This is just like the middle of the story. And where is that that they say? Is that here? Oh yeah. So where Louvre doth renew his horses. So Louvre steals the horses of your reason, and he eventually gets, like, he makes an enemy out of your reason for that. And you're just wondering, like, where. So we have the Veils of Horror. We don't know if this is, like, pre-amnesiac horror. We don't know if this is after. Where are we in the myth? Like, are we in this kind of, like, perennial space that is, like, kind of, like, forever youthful in some way? Like, can we, like, really locate it in any, like, distinctive part of his mythology? Is this, like, all ad hoc, like, post hoc analysis? Like, maybe. But I mean, Blake, he drops these kinds of things. And again, like, you don't even have to definitively answer this. Like, you have enough with the way that horror is presented as, like, a place, right? Outside of the myths, like, just within the poem itself, that you could sort of get the sense of what exactly is happening, where these additional things are just details, right? They're not necessary. But one thing that I want to talk about is, like, so the Book of Thel. The motto, right? So going back to the motto, Thel, perhaps from the Greek thelos, this is probably a correct interpretation, is an unborn spirit forsaking and shrinking back from birth in the physical world. I mean, that's perfectly valid, right? It's definitely a way, based on the discussion that we have, that we could interpret this text, right? The question is, why would you necessarily pigeonhole yourself into this specific, really, like, specific kind of interpretation? I personally don't like that kind of thing. It's too limiting for no like, if you could get really something out of it, fine. But instead, all this does, I feel like, to me, is it kind of, like, it motes away the poem from, like, people that don't know what the Greek word for thelos is, right? And it's also not necessary to really appreciate the poem on really fundamental levels. And this is where we get to the motto, and I see all this kind of stuff a lot in the motto, and it kind of bothers me. So the silver rod and the golden bowl of the motto are symbols of the physical body divided into two sexes, and are partly derived from Ecclesiastes 12:6. So I read this; it actually does, and I think they say the silver cord is broken or something. Like, this is a real stretch. Like, you don't like guys, like, you don't have to do this shit. Like, you don't have to say some shit like this, like, for you to be taken seriously about the Book of Thel. You could be a complete fucking bumblefuck on YouTube with 249 subscribers. Hey, who am I talking about? And you could have a perfectly valid interpretation, as I've been doing. You don't have to bring in Ecclesiastes 12:6 to make a point that, in fact, is not even made by Ecclesiastes 12:6. Are symbols of the physical body? I mean, they might be, to the extent that rods, for corporal punishment, or kings holding scepters, like, clearly, that there is something psychologically there. It's phallic in some way, fine, but they are necessarily symbols that, like, there's already, like, layers that we should be talking about that beyond that, divided into two sexes. I mean, like the point I'm trying to make is, you can, especially in some strained way, but why would you? Like, why would you? Like, why are you doing this? Like, what is your motivation? Right? We're talking about psychological motivations. Clearly, the critics that truly understand Thel's personal psychological motivations, clearly they should know why they are going for certain interpretations over others, right? In the sense that we as critics, this is how we are presently constituted, this is our background, this is what we value, right? But nobody seems to ask these questions. And the motto means, like, I would never say something like this. Like, even thus far, like, I've given you multiple ways to look at this. I will not say the motto means. Like, again, what's the point of this fucking pigeonhole? And especially if you're wrong, and most people are wrong when they talk about literature. Let's see what they say. Is it possible to experience genuine love and wisdom, the role of the eagle, in the physical state, the role of the mole? Uh, uh, this is this I can't say is mostly bullshit, right? I mean, like, based on what? Genuine love and wisdom, the world of the eagle, really? You think that the wisdom here, the eagle, is supposed to be genuine love and wisdom? That's its world, and the mole's world in these 4 lines is supposed to be somehow like beneath him, beneath the eagle, beneath the world of the eagle. Is that reasonable? How is that how is that reasonable? If you just forget anything that you know about anything, just reading the 4 lines and just understanding it grammatically, understanding what the words mean, how is that a reasonable interpretation? So this is bullshit. Is it possible to experience genuine love and wisdom, the world of the eagle, in a physical state, the world of the mole? And this, like, in a physical state, like, you're adding on so much shit for the sake of doing it, right? Same thing with, like, political debate. Why are you making these kinds of assumptions? Like why do you, like, you don't have to do this, guys. You don't have to do this. You don't have to do shit like this to yourself. Okay, that's not necessary. We don't do things like this on this stream. And again, maybe this is commentary for the art house. I used to think, I guess, more highly of the art of William Blake, that, like, the visual art. Let's just choose one that's not, like, offensively ostentatious, right? Something that's not too colorful. I like I sort of like this pink here. Okay, Thel's matter. So yeah, this is like the bells and whistles thing, right? That Blake does. And I mean, like, it sort of works in the sense that, like, it is, like, very distinctive here with this kind of, nice calligraphy. And it's also, like, a great 4 lines. So, and it's also important for the rest of the poem. So this is justify these kinds of bells and whistles. But I remember, like, Dan and I had this conversation, like, back in 2013. He was like, like, Blake's visual art is, like, mostly bullshit, and I guess, like, I've come to realize that it sort of is. But there are things going on, like, with the use of color, that is sort of, outside of the norm. Maybe not engraving the time. Like, I can't say that I know a lot about, like, the worksmanship kind of engraving, where people sort of made a kind of, like, day to day life doing it in the artisan sense, not necessarily in the sense of, like, I'm William Blake and I want to create, like, visionary art. Maybe this use of color was kind of popular. I know that William Blake, with his, like, techniques here, he sort of used techniques that were, like, going out of fashion. So, maybe it's representative of that. Like, I'm not completely sure, but like, conceptually, though, like, this is kind of different, right? You wouldn't necessarily illustrate a book in this way. You wouldn't have figures that are sometimes religious figures or figures from mythology that are presented in this way, that are kind of, like, disconnected from context, given new context. So I still find this interesting conceptually, and of course, the fact that literally this is what the punctuation actually looked like. It's different, but I also can't say that it's necessary. I mean, I guess it's still, I have in my old apartment, I still have, like, my book of, like, all the William Blake books, that are illustrated in this way. And it's like a big book like that. It's sort of nice to look through, but I can't make the argument that this is in any way necessary to what is, in fact, the centerpiece is the fucking poetry. Like, however you feel about his visual art, like, he is a greater poet than he is a visual artist. Whatever you feel about his visual art, I think that the argument is very easy to make for me. But what exactly, like, are we getting, right? What exactly are we getting here? Is this like supposed to be like the lily of the valley, maybe, like, version of the peaceful valley? what is being added. Maybe this is like a means for him to sell his books. Maybe he never really took the visual part that seriously. I don't want to say too much because I don't know that much about that part of his biography. But I just can't say that this kind of like stuff is necessary. I mean, this is an interesting image, right? In some regards, but it's more interesting conceptually than it is technically, right? It's interesting in terms of where it came from, why it came, the kind of temporal context that it's in. I think that's fine. I think we could say that. We don't really see that many kids, babies on dragons, I guess. And is there anything that I wanted to say? Yeah, like more like highly like from Wikipedia, like these highly specific interpretations. Thel's motto can be interpreted as Blake's rejection of the church, and it can, right? It very much can. I mean, he rejected a very specific kind of Christianity. He had his own mythology that built upon it. The silver rod can easily refer to a clergy member. This is true. The silver rod, where wisdom cannot be found, represents a scepter or staff that would have been used in traditional kingship or even high-ranking Ecclesiastes before the rise of nationalism and the consequent fall of the papacy in the 16th and 17th centuries. Okay. You can, right? So you can do it, right? I at least like the fact that, they're saying that this is one of the possibilities. But again, we don't want to limit ourselves to just that, right? This applies to everything, right? Thel's motto applies to today. We could make everything secular. We could even dissolve every kingship and presidency, and we could all be in a communist kind of utopia. This would still apply in some virulent form, right? It's always going to get passed on psychologically, or we're always going to have these kinds of conflicts, which is fine. You just don't want these conflicts to emerge in like this destructive material sense where like on a baseline people are suffering, but psychologically speaking, in other ways, you're always going to have a baseline to deal with. So like the point is, like, to the extent that this is like in the Leonard Shlain model of like looking ahead into the world, Thel and William Blake show you what the world will come to accept in the future once they come to accept his art. Because that's what's going to happen like in society over a long enough period of time. You don't ever want to limit the interpretation and just call it an attack on the papacy, right? Like that's just so keep in mind, clearly this is Blake's context, yes, but there's a lot more there that we could have. The motto goes on to express doubt that love can be found in a golden bowl. The image of the golden bowl refers to a chalice that is raised when priests in the Christian tradition celebrate the Eucharist. Now, that could be one of the things, but it's not the thing. Like it's one of the, to get back, I answered today Art House's a comment on interpretation versus meaning. This could be part and parcel of the totalizing meaning, but it's not the interpretation, is it? Right? It is one of the interpretations that totalizes the meaning. The religious connotations of the rod and bowl help explain the disillusionment that many romantic writers, notably Blake, had with the state church. This type of theological alienation is consistent with the revolutionary and rebellious sentiments of the era. Another interpretation of the silver rod and the golden bowl are that the male and female genitalia. Okay, but it's also everything else that I fucking said. Like I wish I'm gonna close this. I wish that somebody would just kind of like do what I'm doing. Like, you don't see this a lot, right? Which is why I'm doing it. Like, just get on fucking stream and just talk for a couple hours about this poem, okay? And have your own interpretations and like go through the text and have your own like piece of evidence. Like, you're not gonna come, even if your interpretation is good, you're not going to have the same as me, and we're not going to have the same value system. We don't have the same values. We could both work from the assumption that this is like a great and just conceptually, especially revolutionary poem. But some of the things that we see are going to be different. You might very well conclude that some of the initial cliches at the beginning and some of the kind of simplistic, almost like worst of songs of innocence feel is not good enough to sort of hit you over the head with. The repetition of the Lily of the Valley and everybody else is it is too much. Like get to the point, guys. Like you could say that, and I could argue against it, but you need your value system to be engendered by and linked to the actual text, right? The evidence in the text. So that's all that I'm going to say. I think it's kind of worthless for me to say that, hey guys, I'm going to stream X day, because it seems like I'm going to just get on stream anyway before I even tell you when. And I'm going to surprise you guys like this. And maybe if I open up a Patreon, hey, before we even get to a fucking Patreon, which is like way down the line, if you're watching this right now, just like right now. If you're not subscribed, subscribe right now, because I'll keep doing stuff like this, right? This is very helpful to help channels grow. If you're watching it and you like this, especially if you're an ally, if you're a friend of the pod, as it were, just do it, right? I mean, I'm communicating to you right now. Anyway, but I will in fact do, whether or not there's streams that come before, who knows, but I will have another political / whatever stream on Thursday. Yeah, so I'm gonna cut this up. Let me take some comments. Let's see what's going on. Let's scroll up. Blake, Book of Your Reason is banging, Newhouse says. I haven't read it. Maybe you could, maybe we could talk about it at some point. What else we got? Okay, so Ezekiel says golden bone, silver cord, also Ecclesiastes references and permanence of physical things, however beautiful, I think. Yeah, I mean, look, you could say that about Ecclesiastes, but the extent to which, like, I've seen so many critics just like get wedded to this interpretation, they keep fucking saying it. They keep saying it because like it's supposed to be some knockout of why, like if you just talk about this for 2 hours, like I didn't really prepare the stuff. Like I sort of read this a couple of times or whatever, I thought about what I might say, but I mean there's not that much preparation that goes into this, right? Like you just get on and just talk about it. Like you could do this for 2 hours. Like why wed yourself to some pigeonholed ass answer? Like why? You're just limiting yourself. You're forcing yourself to just like repeat what other people are saying, and you're also like not, you're also kind of making yourself like meek, right? By not trying to stake out. You're like what's the I forget what animal that wouldn't even cry for food, right? Like you're one of those, like, oh, not even gonna crave, right? You're not even craving to have your own fucking unique interpretation here, and that's bad, right? You should, if you're in the arts, like you should come in here with a craving for understanding something in a new way. Come on, guys, this is simple shit. Come on. Personally, I've always preferred Blake when he gets slightly sinister. Yeah, like last time when I did that Cradle song. Oh my goodness, from Songs of Innocence. The Cradle song from Songs of Innocence is just wonderful. The mother's like fucking fixations that seems to be fixated on the infant. That seems innocent. Now she's fixated on her own smiles and her own emotions, her own facial expressions. Wow, what's going on? Suddenly she's crying. Now she's fixated on something completely over the top, and you see these like fulcrums just like coming at you so fast. So yeah, like when Blake is sinister, like this is like where like that conceptual modernity comes in. So Elvis says, I think Blake is pretty good, perhaps even a great artist, but that's coming from someone who has only done a Google search of images. I don't know how this totality stuff fares. I am sort of, I guess, emotionally still drawn to it. I find it interesting in the context of the poems, but I find myself kind of, it's difficult for me to say that his visual art is really any good. Like some, I guess, what is like is it your reason, like measuring out the cosmos? Or is that supposed to be like a Newtonian figure? Like Blake also had this like complex with Newton, as a lot of romantics, I guess, did. Romantics are in the shadow of Newton. Like it's hard to sort of maybe conceptualize for us, but I mean back then, like what he already fucking moved the needle so far in a certain direction intellectually, in a certain direction when it comes to, even in some ways perhaps in the arts, there was an influence. So he had this, like Blake had this thing I don't know if it's your reason or if it's just a generic kind of like Newton type figure, like with a compass, like measuring out the universe. And Blake said, listen, we can do some of this, but you need like that Louvre thing, right? You need that emotion. You need to understand how the two combine with one another to make meaning, intelligible. Which is, again, going back to the Leonard Shlain thing. When Leonard Shlain says that visual art allows you to see ahead scientifically into like things that will happen in physics down the road, and that might still in fact be the case. I mean, I don't know who the new crop of like revolutionary artists are right now. Who knows what we're gonna think like 2 centuries from today? But how did I get on this shit? Damn, you guys have to keep me on topic. How to get into this? I was talking about your reason, compass, measuring out the universe. Oh, so if Blake is saying this 200 years ago, and we know now for a fact that everybody that says that, guys, don't use emotion in your thinking, well, here are the facts. If we take away the part of your brain that is mediated by, or in some way by emotion, like I said before, you're not going to be able to make intellectual judgments. You just can't. Okay, even if you can intellectually come up with an argument weighing the pros and cons of something before coming to some sort of objective decision, you're never actually, when you take away that emotional component, this is what science and psychology says today, you take away that emotional component, you will not even be able to weigh the options out, right? And Blake is seeing this, right? Like Blake is seeing this in the visual arts, right? He's like, listen, we can measure out the universe in some regards, but this can't be it, right? And the poetry is full of this, and poetry before Blake. I guess I mean, I mentioned the John Donne Blake connection in the last stream, and we could still say that John Donne also had this like critique of imperfect knowledge, especially not just imperfect knowledge in terms of like secular knowledge, trying to sort of perhaps debunk God, but even constantly doubting his own religious knowledge, his own personal feelings, like saying that this is not enough. We can't just fully measure things, right? And Blake see this, and now we know that this is in fact the case. Without emotion, you will not intellectually adjudicate a thing, right? And which is why emotion and thinking is just so important in some ways to discuss, which is why the psychological side of things I spent so long on with J-Cho. There's a lot of stuff there that's usable. Okay, I'm really hungry. I should go eat soon. Okay, let's say what else we got. I have a print, New House, from a watercolor from Blake's Divine Comedy on my wall. Good visual artist. So I'm glad that at least my sort of like feelings and instincts towards this are not completely off the wall. I mean, you're a smart guy. Maybe the way that you're negotiating these values makes perfect sense as well. Zeke, I recall your view that Blake was a proto-modern. I mean, clearly, right? We just went through this poem. This is proto-modernism. That strange turn near the end of the poem, I think, borrows from Job, as is the whole text, but the language is so unexpected and fresh. Yeah, I mean, I remember seeing critiques from the 70s, like scholars were making fun of this like thing that Blake was influenced by the Bible. I mean, like, okay, so if you want to be one of these people that, wants to say new shit, like, don't go the other direction and say, well, it's a cliche and it's dumb to say that, Blake is influenced by the Bible. I mean, hello, he is. We don't have to go, I'm not going to say it, stream might get canceled. A lot of weird compositions and transparent color techniques. Yeah, I mean, I think that's why I'm sort of drawn to it. I mean, at least, like, I said that I wanted to choose the least annoying color scheme out of those plates. Like, definitely, like, Blake could really, he had, like, so many different versions, a lot of these books, when he, did the visual stuff. Some of the colors though are just so gaudy, right? And I mean, some of it, I guess that does make it kind of interesting, but I can't make like a good objective case in the same way that I might make for like a Rembrandt or whatever. Anyway, okay, are we good? Okay, I'm gonna go eat. Thank you guys for watching. Again, if you haven't hit like, if you're still watching this, please hit like. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. I'm gonna have at minimum another stream on Thursday, 7 p.m. Eastern, perhaps even a little bit earlier. We'll see. I'll set it up beforehand so that you guys know where we are, like when to expect it. Um, a few hours. Then should be good. Okay, maybe I'll have some other videos in between. Who knows? But okay, nice talking to you. Ending the stream. Goodbye.